Good to have each of you here tonight. We are going to be studying from Matthew chapter 25, a familiar parable to us. This chapter, Matthew 25, has a lot to do with readiness, being prepared, the uncertainty of the future, and matters like that. And so it does have application to everybody, considering that none of us know the future. None of us know how much time we have. We certainly don't know when the Lord's going to come back or how things are going to go with that exactly. So we're going to have to be prepared and be ready. And there's an implication there of responsibility. There's an implication of a willingness to be prepared. And so even though this is a very familiar parable, I hope it'll be a good study for us this evening. As you think about this parable, it's rather straightforward. The master is leaving. He's going to be gone for a while. They're not told how long, but it's going to be a long time. As we find out when he comes back, it was a long time. But he entrusts three different servants with different amounts. 1 5 talents, 1 2 talents, and one with 1 talent. Not everybody was given the same thing. Not everybody had the same abilities. They were only asked to do a certain amount, and even that wasn't really specified. But as we're going to be looking at mainly about the man with 1 talent, he didn't do anything with that, and he ended up losing everything. So as we think about ourselves in this study tonight, I'm not going to have you stand up if you've got 1 talent or 2 or 5. We're not going to do that, but I do want us to think about our abilities, think about our responsibilities, and matters like that. I don't know how many talents I have. I don't know how many talents you have, and that's really beside the point when it comes down to it. Because as we look at this, it is about using what we do have, and whether it's 5 or whether it's 1, we have the ability to do something. And that's really kind of the point of all of this. So, if you only have 1 talent, as the title of this lesson is, then use it. That's really what it's about. So let's dig into this a little bit and talk about some of the aspects of this parable. Notice some things about this 1 talent man. He did accept responsibility for the talent that he was entrusted with. I think that's rather interesting when you think about it in the scheme of the entire story. Is he was given this, and there was an expectation there. He took this amount of money, and he knew that he was going to be liable for that. In verse 24, when he's talking to the master again, the one who had received the 1 talent came up and said, "Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow and gathering where you scattered no seed." He understood. He understood about his master. He understood there was going to be an accounting. There was going to be a liability there that he was going to have. And so he understood that. And so that should not have been a surprise when the master came back and said, what have you got? That should not have been a surprise. And he was accountable for what he did with what he was entrusted with. It's also interesting that he was not given more than was appropriate for him. He was given 1 talent. That doesn't mean he was worthless. Doesn't mean he didn't have any value. He was given 1 talent. And so as you think about that, there's risk involved with utilizing those things. When we're talking about investments like these individuals were involved with, there certainly was risk. There was a chance they could lose everything. But the point was they were supposed to do something with what they were entrusted with. Certainly, there's a risk of involved in following Christ. We have to make some sacrifices. We have to do some things, and we have to count that cost whenever we decide we're going to be Christians. When we're going to follow Jesus, we have to count that cost. And like Paul talks about in 2 Corinthians 12 and verse 15, "I will most gladly spend and be expended for your souls. If I love you the more, am I to be loved the less?" And so Paul said basically he's willing. He was willing to do what it took be the Christian that he was supposed to, and to be the example for them, and to do what was necessary for them. There's certainly a risk involved, but of course there's reward involved, as we well know. But just to think about that, there was responsibility there, and he took that on in that decision. He had all he could use. Look at verse 15. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, and to another 1, each according to his own ability, and he went on his journey. And so as you think about that again, he was given 1. He wasn't given 5. He wasn't given 2. He was given 1. That was what his ability was, as his master had determined that. And so it wasn't up to him to assess himself, to figure out what he was going to take on. It was the master, and he was given all that the master felt like he could use. Now, as we think about ourselves in regards to this, as I mentioned early on, I don't know how many talents each of us have or anything like that. We do have different abilities. We do have different blessings. I think most would agree that we have a lot of blessings in many different ways, but they're not all the same. And we're not all the same in who we are and backgrounds and abilities and all those things. We have different of those. And so as we think about ourselves in regards to that, it is interesting to consider the different abilities and blessings that we do have. And we have the responsibility to use those things as God would have us to. We see this in the first century outside of just this particular chapter. We see this with the spiritual gifts even. There were those with different spiritual gifts. And as Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians 12, there's one and the same Spirit that works all these things, distributing to each one individually, just as he wills. It was up to the Spirit to make that determination. Who had a gift of knowledge, who had a gift of prophecy, who had a gift of wisdom, who had a gift of healing, who had a gift of interpretation of those things. That was all outside of anybody's ability other than the Spirit. Now we know from the church at Corinth that there was emphasis placed by some on certain gifts over another. There were some that wanted the gift of prophecy. There were some that wanted the gift of speaking in tongues, especially in Corinth. And that was viewed as a priority of sorts. But they really didn't have a choice on what they were given. The Spirit worked differently, and that was up to him. And so as you think about that, I find that interesting. Not everybody had the same thing. There were some differences that were there. And so that's certainly interesting as well for us to consider for ourselves. Now, we're not talking about us having spiritual gifts like they did in the first century today, but certainly there's differences between us. And it's not about seeing who has the most or seeing who's more different, or if you're better than somebody else, or putting somebody up on a pedestal over somebody else. It's not about that at all, nor was it about that in Matthew chapter 25, but it was about using what you did have. And even we have different results in the first century, depending on the efforts of different people. Paul talks about that in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 6 through 8, when he says, I planted, Apollos watered, but God was causing the growth. So then neither the one who plants nor the one who waters is anything, but God who causes the growth. Now he who plants and he who waters are one, but each will receive his own reward according to his own labor. It's not all the same, is it? It's all pretty important. What's more important, planting or watering? Well, you hate to have to choose one, would you? They're both pretty important, aren't they? If you're going to have anything happen with that plant, but they're different, and different abilities by different people doing different things like that. And so it is something to think about in regards to our own abilities and all of that. It's not all going to be the same, but we all have responsibility. Some people have better health. Some people have more knowledge. Some people have more zeal. Some people have any host of variables from one extreme to another. Some people grow faster than other people do. Some people study comes a little more naturally to them. Others it doesn't. Some people we may feel like have fewer obstacles, although that's usually an excuse for ourselves if we think that about somebody. So there's all sorts of things out there like that can be good or can be bad or can be a blessing or something that maybe we view not quite as much. And so there's choices we have to make as to what we're going to do and how we're going to utilize the abilities that we do have. And so all of that to say, the man with one talent had some ability. It wasn't about measuring himself against others. It was about using what he had and using it in the way that the master saw fit. The same thing is true for us. We get caught up in the weeds if we're about trying to compare with one person to another instead of whatever we have the ability to do to be able to do those things. And so we don't need to miss the point of what's being talked about. Ultimately, regardless of our situation, we should be using whatever our abilities are to the glory of God. And that's really what we see here in Matthew chapter 25. That's really what we see throughout the scriptures, using what we do have for God's glory. Matthew 5 and verse 16, Jesus said, "Let your light shine before men in such a way that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven." Well, what if my light isn't as bright as yours? What if somebody else has a brighter light? So that doesn't mean that we're not to shine our light, right? That doesn't mean that we can't be a light. You can't go around saying, well, I'm just going to turn my bulb off because somebody else has a brighter bulb. That doesn't mean anything, does it? It doesn't mean anything in the scheme of all of that. We have to do what we can do to the glory of God. Let your light shine before men in such a way that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. And so that's something for all of us to think about as well. It's much more important to utilize what we have instead of taking comparative notes with others. As you think about some of these things, look over in 1 Peter chapter 4. 1 Peter chapter 4, verses 10 and 11. As each one has received a special gift, employ it in serving one another as good stewards of the manifold grace of God. Whoever speaks, let him speak as it were the utterances of God. Whoever serves, let him do so by the strength which God supplies, so that in all things God may be glorified through Jesus Christ, to whom belongs the glory and dominion forever and ever. Amen. What this is not about is trying to figure out, well, is it talking about spiritual gifts or is it not? And this is the whole point about gifts and abilities. Whether in the first century it was spiritual gifts, they still had a responsibility to use that as God intended for his glory and for his purpose. And whether it's that or not, we still have the opportunity to serve one another. We still have the opportunity to be good stewards of the manifold grace of God. We still have the opportunity to speak as the oracles of God or to serve in the strength which God supplies. But in all of that, do that God may be glorified. And that's really the point here. What are we doing with what we do have? And are we glorifying God in those things? We don't need to worry about what we view as limitations or things that are not as good as someone else. If we have a limitation on our time, if we have a limitation on our health or on our knowledge or on our courage, it's not about that. It's about what do we have? It's about where can we start and what do we do with what we have and go from there. It's not about saying, well, when I get to this point, then I'll do something with it. It's about whatever we have, use it to the glory of God. Luke 16 and verse 10, he who is faithful in a very little thing is faithful also in much, and he who is unrighteous in a very little thing is unrighteous also in much. You know, it's just like generosity in some ways. If you say, well, when I have X amount of money, then I'll be generous. If I get to this point, then I'll be different. It doesn't work that way, does it? If we are generous, we're going to be generous regardless of what we have or we don't have. if we're going to be giving or loving or any kind of quality you can think of. It's not going to be when we get to this point, then we'll start. It's going to be how we choose to be in whatever our circumstances are. And that's something I think we can all appreciate, hopefully, as we think about ourselves in these regards. God cares a lot about little things as much as he does big things. And the man with 1 talent wasn't less important than the man with 5. It's not that God didn't notice him because he didn't have as much as somebody else. Quite different. We don't need to think that God doesn't see those things that go on. God doesn't miss the details in the matter. And maybe we view talents and abilities that way, but certainly God does not. So he had what he could use. The main point was that he used that and not have an excuse for what he goes on to do. Which brings up the next point. He tried to excuse himself. Verse 25, I was afraid and went away and hid your talent in the ground. See, you have what is yours. So what's his alibi that he uses there? Well, his alibi is fear. I was afraid, and so I didn't do anything with that. So he thinks that that's somehow going to be an excuse for him doing what he does. That's not really so different than how we can be today. We might think we have a good excuse. Mainly it comes down to trying to compare with other people and saying, well, I don't have all that, so therefore I should be excused. I shouldn't have to have any responsibility, when of course that's beside the point once again. But often we like a good excuse if it's in our favor, right? We don't like it so much when it's somebody else, but we like to offer excuses whenever we can. And we have excuses for all kinds of things. I didn't get my homework done because, I was robbed on the side of the road or something, and they didn't want my wallet or keys. They just wanted my homework. There's any number of things that people come up with that sound reasonable to them. And yet, when it comes down to it, and you think about our subject matter and what's really important and the Lord and what we're doing in this life and how we're desiring to get from here to the next life, the home in heaven, excuses aren't going to go very far, are they? There's not going to be any excuses on Judgment Day whenever we think about that. What are you going to say when you're standing before the Lord on Judgment Day? Are we really going to have any excuses? Are we really going to be able to say, yeah, I know, but? Doesn't seem like to me we're really going to be able to do that. Nor can I think of anything that would be a viable excuse. That doesn't seem like it would be reasonable. The first couple chapters of Romans, at least a couple times, the word excuse is given. Romans chapter 1 and verse 20, talking about the Gentiles, but certainly has application to everybody in this particular area. He says, for since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse. Is there an excuse for not believing in God? Not really, is there? Not any good ones. In fact, he says there's no excuse. So we should be able to look around at the creation and recognize that there is something more than just ourselves. There's something greater, a designer, than just us. And as he goes on in this chapter to really talk about the Gentiles and their slant down away from God and the way that they were doing things, when he gets to the second chapter, of course, he starts talking about the Jews. And I'm sure the Jews felt like all the criticism in chapter 1 was right on target. But then he starts off in chapter 2 in verses 1 and 2 by saying, therefore, you are without excuse, every man of you who passes judgment. For in that you judge another, you condemn yourself. For you who judge practice the same things. And we know that the judgment of God rightly falls upon those who practice such things. So it's easy to look at somebody else and say, see, he's right on with that, as long as it deflects away from myself, right? But Paul's making the point that the Jews were just as guilty as the Gentiles were in this regard. They would condemn them for the very same things that they were guilty of, but felt they were better off because they were Jews. And as he goes through in this chapter to talk about some of those things, he really makes the point, you who teach others, are you not also teaching yourself? Are you going to be unfaithful to the Lord, and yet you're going to teach somebody how to be faithful? Are you going to be committing immorality and talking to somebody about being a moral person? Where are you going to fall down on that? We can't expect that we can live differently than what it is that we're practicing. So how are we going to have any excuse on Judgment Day? We're not going to be able to blame anybody else for our circumstances and for our deficiencies. There's not going to be anywhere else to place that blame because God has revealed his will and has made those things known. Romans 14 and verse 12, each one of us will give an account of himself to God. I'm not going to be able to stand before God and say, but he, but she. It's going to be on me, isn't it? 2 Corinthians 5 and verse 10, we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, that each one may be recompensed for his deeds in the body according to what he has done, whether good or bad. I'm going to have to give an account for myself. You're going to have to give an account for yourself. And those are some sobering things to think about. Excuses are just that, and certainly thinking about the judgment day, it's a pretty sobering thing to consider what would be acceptable before God. We really don't have an excuse. Finally tonight, he lost his talent. When it was all said and done, even the little bit that he had, comparatively speaking, was taken away and given to somebody else. Look at verses 28 through 30. Therefore, take away the talent from him and give it to the one who has the 10 talents. For to everyone who has shall more be given, and he shall have an abundance. But from the one that does not have, even what he does have shall be taken away. And cast out the worthless slave into the outer darkness. In that place there shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So it's not a matter of you had the one, you had the ability to do better, and now you have zero again. It's a lot worse than that. It's much worse because we find out that he's lost his soul. He loses everything in all of this. There is no going back to square one and starting out with the zero you had before. It's much worse than that. He doesn't have anything. He loses his soul. Whereas the previous two heard the words, well done, good and faithful servant, enter into the joys of your master. He hears that and has an excuse for why he does what he does. How horrible to hear blessings bestowed on others, knowing that he stood guilty and had not done what the master required. The worst part of that, probably, is the fact that it would have been a rejection from the Lord. He would have been away from his presence indefinitely. 2 Thessalonians 1 and verse 9, these will pay the penalty of eternal destruction away from the presence of the Lord and from the glory of his power. Let's not let that be us. We don't want to be in that category. We don't want to be those who have to spend an eternity away from the Lord. So wrapping this up tonight and thinking about some of these things, these are some pretty sobering things to consider and very important ones to consider. And of course, that's why they're in this chapter about being ready and being prepared and all of that. We sing a song sometimes about there is room in the kingdom. And rightly so, because there is work that we all can do. There's something for everybody. And again, we miss the point if we make it about who has more, who has less. It's not about that at all. Regardless of our abilities, be it many or few, there's room in the kingdom, and there is work that we all can do. We spend a lot of time doing a lot of different things with various pursuits, but we are going to be held accountable for the priority that we have while on this earth, whether or not we are following after the Lord, whether or not we are serving him. As Jesus said in Matthew 16 and verses 24 through 27, Jesus says to his disciples, if anyone wishes to come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross and follow me. For whoever wishes to save his life shall lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake shall find it. For what will a man be profited if he gains the whole world and forfeits his soul? Or what will a man give in exchange for his soul? For the Son of Man is going to come in the glory of his Father and his angels, and will then recompense every man according to his deeds. Don't do somebody else's work. Don't be the 5-talent person if you're not the 5-talent person. He's not asking that of you. What he is asking is to do the work that you're given. Do what you can do. Do something with what you have. It doesn't have to be as much as somebody else. It's not a competition like that. Do something with what you've been entrusted with. That's why the 1-talent man was condemned. He did nothing with what he had. Couldn't you have just put it in the bank and drew some interest? That would have been something, but he just buried it. He just handed it back to him. Here, what you have is what you left is what you have. He didn't do anything with it. What are we doing with what's been entrusted to us? Let's make sure that you and I are loyal and faithful to the Lord in all the things that we do. Even when we don't understand fully everything, because we won't ever, when we don't understand fully his purpose, or when we can't see visible results in what we're doing, that doesn't mean nothing good is happening or nothing good is being accomplished. It just means I can't see visible results of what's happening, if that's the case. But we still are responsible to do the things that we can do. God does not ask more of us than what we're able to do. And I hope that as we think about these things tonight, we can appreciate this particular story, this parable, and recognize ourselves in each of this storyline to make sure we see the need to do something with what God has entrusted to us. If your life is not right with the Lord, I hope tonight you'll take advantage of the opportunity to change that. The Lord desires us to be workers in the kingdom. He desires us to do something with our abilities and our talents. And he's made it possible for us to be right in his sight, to have that relationship with him, to be forgiven of our sins, and to look forward to that home in heaven. And what a blessing that is that we can look forward to that, because none of us deserve that for sure, but we can look forward to that, and he's promised us that home in heaven. Tonight, if we can help in any way in getting your life back right, we would like to assist you. If you let it be known by coming forward, together we stand and sing. Just